name is Speedy. Can't think why, but it's what creatures call me anyway.
There's not too much to talk about Speedy in terms of development or even too much of character. She's basically another comic relief character in that she obviously is a fast talker and is very proud of herself and doesn't really like people interrupting her own view of how she either views herself or how she views how the world should be. But in terms of a comic relief, she's okay, I guess. There are definitely a lot more funny characters that give a lot more funnier moments, but occasionally she can be funny when there's actual misery on her part, like when Whistler gagged her during the fight between Scarface and Fox, because we learn to kind of loathe her character, so when bad things do happen to her, we find it amusing, as sick as that may sound. But regardless, that's how I've always viewed it, and she's decent enough, but nothing really to remember distinctly.
I can't face trouble. I'm a weasel. It's my nature to run away from trouble whenever I see it.
Measley, despite being a character that was introduced in this series and wasn't given that much screen time than the other characters, is actually surprisingly developed. He starts off, of course, as just being head over heels in love with Weasel, but after she's forcibly connected to a person who he is ungodly afraid of and can't stand to be around, he kind of has to force that vision of said person onto the person he loves as well. And you can clearly tell that it kills him to be away from her, in how he said that he clearly still loves her and is over the moon for her, but he just can't be around her because of the danger involved, though it does get a bit harsh in the way that he says that and treats Weasel later on. But once the situation is resolved, the two of them end up together, and they basically become the new comic duo that basically takes up where Rabbit and Mrs. Rabbit used to be, and gets explored in a way that we probably didn't really need to see in the next series.
Those Farthing creatures are going to rue the day they ever set foot in White Deer Park.
Okay, so we're talking about Scarface now, are we? Okay, well I guess the best way to put it is that, like I said earlier, he's the kind of person who commodifies everything, in that he sees the people and places around him not much as things to care about or to protect, but more as things to own and to fight for their ownership over. So in many ways he's a bit of a cliched villain who in his own way just wants world domination, but only when you look at him through that way. However, in another way of seeing it, I see it as a person who feels like he's always had something to prove and is constantly feeling like he needs to prove himself at something, because while his superiority element comes off as obviously him being his natural gruff self, in some ways I also feel like it's him trying to prove his significance and dismay his insignificance, because it's clearly shown that he doesn't like being seen as weak, which also comes through in his treatment of Lady Blue. So in that regard it makes him less of a Doctor Doom and more of a Syndrome, someone who has potentially gone through some really hard times in his life, as indicated by the scar itself, and is now trying to prove himself and feel security in the knowledge that everything he sees is his to command. Again, this might just be me overanalyzing it, but that's how I've always seen him. But of course his pride never once let up and allowed him to just admit that sometimes it's good to allow other people to own things instead of him in order to trust other people. So much like I said, the difference between him and Fox is that pride is the main element here. Fox allowed his pride to be shattered sometimes and admit that he was wrong. Scarface would never do such a thing, and that's where he fell down. And of course his pride got the better of him when, in a moment of trying to exert his dominance, the animal who he had abused previously eventually got her revenge, making it a classic story of a person who wrote their own ending. Getting away from the melancholy analysing for a minute, in terms of his character, he actually is very enjoyable. He has some sort of Ray Winstone spud gun assassin gangster quality to him, both in his voice and his personality, yet they do allow him to make faults and make him look like a fool to show that he's a little bit more three-dimensional and more down to earth, though in some regards you could say that that takes away the threat of him as a villain, as I've said before. But I've always liked villains that are shown failing, since it makes them seem a lot more human really, and it is enjoyable to watch just to see how much of an arsehole he can be to the people around him. So for the first major reoccurring villain, he was definitely a very good execution, and it's clear that other people thought so too, considering how much the fan base absolutely adores him.
What kind of mother leaves her cubs unattended?
Lady Blue is also a much beloved character of the fan base, though for completely different reasons for her husband. As mentioned earlier in the series, their relationship and the way that we watch them is very much like the Joker and Harley Quinn. One so compelling to watch because of how entertaining they are, whereas the other compelling to watch watch because of how much you sympathise with them. Lady Blue is clearly not treated very well by Scarface, and of all the people who he considers to just be mere commodities to his name, Lady Blue may be one of the ones that is the greatest example of that. In fact, it could be interpreted that the only reason they became a couple is because he's obsessed with the idea of superior genes of blue foxes, or something like that. So naturally, Lady Blue herself acts like she's always got something to prove to her husband that she's more than just a commodity and to get his respect, as demonstrated about how she basically taunts and antagonizes any person she comes across who is not a blue fox, which is also exacerbated by her very proud and narcissistic nature, and of course comes to a head when she battles against her antithesis with Vixen, in where she is very badly beaten down and loses, in more way than one really. However, her character doesn't really go anywhere after that, and then in the final episode she basically just disappears. The last time we see her is grieving over Scarface's dead body, and then she's never seen again throughout the entire show, which is a shame really, because her character had a lot of potential on where they could have gone, and even could have become a really good second villain kind of character, getting revenge for Scarface. But sadly that comes down to really wasted potential. Still, she is enjoyable for the time we do see her, though it is a shame that she never really got to have a proper comeuppance against Scarface.
I have to do it my own way, Shadow. Otherwise, I might as well never have left White Deer Park.
Bold is yet another full can of worms here, but since his character develops over the course of only half a season, it won't be quite as difficult to go into overall what kind of character he is. Of course, when we first see him, he's a very playful and adventurous young pup, so naturally he becomes a person who likes to be his own identity, and he doesn't like other people telling him what to do, and doesn't really like other people weighing him down. And is also shown to be quite smart and curious, but maybe a little bit too much for his own good, which of course comes to his state of being when he becomes a teenager, and how he has the idea of what his father should be, and that he should be the brave Farthing fox that everyone says that he is, and basically just destroy the opposition, no questions asked. Of course, this is when Fox is trying to push the idea of peace and mutual understanding rather than just go all out and attack the enemy, and Bold, being the young and impulsive one, thinks that it's a stupid idea. Bold is being more impulsive and just wants to act so, and as a result, he feels caged and imprisoned just being in the park. In other words, the park isn't big enough for both him and his dad, and so his story basically becomes a coming-of-age story for a vermin. Things start off good and it feels like his life is sunshine and rainbows, but then his life takes a darker turn and things become harder and harsher. But Bold seems to be under the idea that despite all the things he's gone through, the hurts, the heartache, the loss of depth perception and being able to run, I never got the impression that he actually regretted his life choice, that he strove on only looking for the future and never the past. So he's quite a heroic character and very endearing to keep watching through his dedication, though one could argue that he regretted his choice after Whisper breaks his heart. But I saw nothing definitive that he truly did, but I do like how he isn't too proud to accept help, and much like his father, he wouldn't have been able to go on for so long if he didn't get help from others, and he eventually ends this series, as well as his life, now understanding the importance of the oath and his father's ideals, and knowing how the world really is. So it's sad to see someone who went through so much to just die as they, in a way, became a complete person, though in many ways, when that does happen, the only things that they can do are over. But Bold was a great character to watch, and his journey will last in the minds of the fans as the greatest and saddest moment in the Farthingwood history.
You must understand, I'm a Farthing fox. I'm bound by the oath.
Charmer is very opposite in terms of how she was compared to her brother and father, and definitely takes after her mother in that she seems to be able to see the good in almost everyone and everything. The prime example in how she fell in love with Ranger despite the fact that her family was at war with his clan, and she was very well aware of that. Yet she was still open-minded enough and compassionate enough to be able to see the good in him and know that he was truly a good person. Though what I do like is that she does have her limits and is willing to go through more negative emotions, as exampled was when she had a bit of a tiff with Ranger when she first met him, even though that was a bit overlooked by the next time she heard about Ranger's potential death and she's shown being scared and worried for him. But the range of emotions is still good to see, other than the fact that there's not a whole lot to talk about her in terms of the grand scheme of things. But she was a very nice and compelling character, and her relationship with Ranger was something that you legitimately wanted to see come through with a happy ending.
It was silly of Bold to go off like that, but not to worry. You've still got me.
I've gone over Friendly's character change from the books and its effect on both the grand scheme of things and how it was affected within the show to great detail in a previous episode, so I won't prattle on too much here, but I will say that despite the fact that his name doesn't really reflect his personality, he does actually have a very natural personality to him in how you think it would be. We see from an early age that he likes to be somewhat of the suck-up in the family, determined to be able to follow his parents' every word and make them happy. So naturally in that regard, when he is aware of the war between their family and the Blue Foxes, naturally he would be on his guard and be extremely hesitant on it. Though the sad thing is that he never really learns of his mistakes, and the fact that even though it is good to listen to your parents, you should also need to learn on how to be your own individual person, which is why when you think that when Bold finally made it back to White Deer Park, it would have been good to have Friendly go and see him to tell him that it's good to be your own person. Actually, that might not be the case given how Bold looked when he got back. Regardless, while he's not the most enjoyable character, you can understand where he's coming from, though I do wish his character was a bit more developed by the end of the series.
Would I hurt anything so lovely?
Ranger has always been an interesting enigma for me, particularly because I feel like the way his character is and the voice he's given just don't quite match up. Ranger's always been sort of the reluctant thug kind of character, someone who is told to do bad things and has somewhat of an inkling to want to do them, yet just can't bring himself to actually do it, and see something in Charmer that she feels the same way about her duties within her family and thus forms a connection with it. In fact, he actually reminds me a lot of Vlad from Young Dracula, a person who's told to be one thing, but is clearly too much of a nature where he doesn't want to do it. And yet despite that, he's given a voice that sounds like it belongs to a sleazy conman kind of character, and as I've said before, sounds an awful lot like Jonathan Ross's voice.
I can sort you out a nice orgy later on, should the mood take you. What do you say?
Who, as entertaining as he can be sometimes, I don't buy the idea of compassionate, reluctant, or even empathetic at all in his voice. No offense, Johnny. So I do like the way his character is supposed to be, I just don't understand why they chose his kind of voice for him, which was actually somewhat of a small occurring problem within the series and continually became a much more major one in the following series. But regardless, Ranger is still a nice character, it's just that whenever he speaks to Charmer it sounds like he's actually got much more of a darker, ulterior motive on his mind.
At least I don't have to pretend to be my father anymore.
Mossy is another character whose centre revolves around reluctance, in this case in that he's reluctant to take on the guise of his late father. However, whereas Ranger in his reluctance came from a desire to do good things, Mossy's reluctance comes more from the idea that he just doesn't really want to do them, and in some cases almost seems irritated by it. Now granted, the premise of what he actually has to do I think any person would be reluctant towards, so I can definitely understand that, but it seems like he can be a little bit too teenager-ish sometimes in the way that he acts towards Badger and some of the other characters, though it's not to the point where you don't like him or becomes distracting. In the whole, he's basically a very timid person like his father, but has more of an outgoing sense of mind, which is actually very nice to see, and his character does elevate into some more selfish natures in a good way in the next series.
Aren't you afraid of the humans?
There's not a whole lot to say about Robber. He's essentially a guardian angel kind of character, but one that's a little bit more alternate than most ones are. In fact, he's much more of an artful dodger kind of character, someone who knows the darker elements but is able to make it work to his advantage. And clearly he has a good heart and a sense of morality in how he's able to help out Bold even in situations where he's putting his own life at risk. So in that regard he's very enjoyable. I just wish that we could see more of him is all.
You're not like other foxes, are you?
Shadow is the kind of character who, like many in the series, could have just been a gender swap version of the animal that she shares the same species with, and while she does have a little bit of the kind-hearted and parental nature that Badger had, she's very much the opposite of him in that when interacting with Bold and later her mate in the following series, she's very much the level-headed, no-nonsense, straight-to-the-point kind of character. She's very logical and understands what needs to be done in more dire situations, but is still very kind-hearted and willing to look out for others at the same time. In fact, it's funny that I joked that she was voiced by Peter Capaldi because of the accent she affected, because in many ways Peter Capaldi's Doctor Who is very much like the kind of character that she is, which of course is lovely to see. But yeah, she essentially takes on the surrogate mother role for Bold during his adventures and also acts like a guardian angel, hence how she got her nickname, and her personality and voice made her a character that you enjoyed seeing, and I'm glad about that because she only has more appearances from here on out.
Forgive me, Bold! But what else can I do?
Whisper is definitely a character where you either love her or you hate her. I'd like to feel I fall a little bit more in between. She's definitely detestable in some of the horrible decisions she makes towards Bold, and her rather uptight, stereotypical city girl personality can get a bit grating. However, Whisper kind of redeems herself in a certain way in where she clearly realises what she did was a mistake, and sometimes her personality can have levity in intense situations, and her presence is a nice element to a coming-of-age story, to the idea that you find a person who seems as if all your problems go away, and then they become the centerfold of your entire problem. So I definitely like elements of her character, primarily the role that she plays within the grand sense of the story, and the fact that her character does seem to go through a legitimate arc, though it can be argued if she actually does learn her lesson, or if she just feels bad about what she's doing is another matter altogether. But regardless, I can definitely understand where people are coming from when they say that they don't like her character, and I can't deny that I can definitely see that as well. But she did provide some elements that provided to the story and the characters that she interacted with to prove that she wasn't a complete waste of space, though it can be argued if she is or if she isn't in the next series or not. The animation is once again going to be one of those things that is one of the more easier and also harder things to talk about in the analysis portion this time, in that while admittedly not a whole lot has been changed since the last time, what has been changed is something that needs to be looked at on a much more defined observation, so we might as well go right into it. In terms of actual movement and the way things are animated in the less broad term, it's mostly the same as it was the last series. It's still that Martin Rosen quality, and the animals often don't really move whilst they're talking. The animals do have a very anthropomorphized quality to them, and the colouring is used in a much more realistic way rather than being overly vibrant and colourful. However, where things change is in some of the designs. A prime example would be if you were to look at Weasel and Measly back to back. If you look at Weasel, you'll notice she has very dot-like, simple-looking eyes, very much like the eyes that you would use on Winnie the Pooh. A lot of the characters in the first series had eyes like this, which made things look a lot more simple. No irises or too much detail, more or less just a circle of black with a small circle of white in the centre. When you look at Measly, on the other hand, you can see that there's a lot more detail put into the way his eyes are animated, which allows Measly to have much more cartoonish expressions. And as the key words when looking at some of the newer designs, cartoonish is definitely one of them. And while the animals from the first series were drawn to be slightly realistic but still have a slight cartoonish quality to them, characters like Measly, Robert and Rollo show that some of the designs went for more of a child-friendly fit, which in some ways is actually kind of warranted, as I'll get into when we get to the themes. But it can sometimes contrast when many of the other characters are still designed more realistically and use the palette from Series 1, not the least of which being that the original characters still use their same models, but some of the other new characters utilise the same kind of design quality for them as well. A primary example being the both Fox families. Now granted, they were being wise in keeping the cartoonish designs to the characters that were made for more comic relief, which is both effective for its use in comic relief and also makes a bit more sense. But when you have characters that look like this, and then have other characters that look like this, it creates an odd contrast which makes it seem like they're almost not even from the same franchise, and this may have caused problems in-house for some of the previous comic relief characters like Weasel and Mole, when they retained their designs but were animated in a way to act more like the comic relief in this series, which can look out of place when the design wasn't made to do stuff like that. Regardless of that though, it does still manage to work, and it's not too distracting to the point where it outright ruined the show, and it seems like they may have learnt their lesson by the following series, since by then all the animation was made to look like it was taken from the same palette, and all the character designs were done from the ground up. But on the stuff that was retained from the first series that still works, the backgrounds are still incredibly gorgeous to look at, and even more impressive this time because they used new locations like the city, which even though we'd been inside the city before in the show, this time the designs take it into a more deeper quality, showing more detailed elements of said city. And White Deer Park itself is wonderfully designed as a backdrop, having a sense of security and an enclosed element that makes it feel safe, however still manages to retain the element of anticipation and danger, in that you really don't know what's behind any of the trees amongst this place, and that there still may be an enemy lurking behind every one of them. So I definitely have to give kudos for that. In terms of the themes that were carried on from the previous series that was still present in this one, of course we still have the element of teamwork and banding together to overcome a threat that is much greater than you individually, yet as a team you're greater than the sum of your parts. Though this really is mostly only present in the winter segment of the story, but it is utilised well, in that the animals do have lots of big threats that are much bigger than themselves, and the teamwork, and particularly the leadership, manages to get them through it, and it results in some of the greatest moments in the series. And of course the oath is still present, though thankfully we've gone beyond just constantly quoting the word as if it's some sort of mantra, and they have actually gotten into the element of showing its effects rather than just constantly talking about it. Once again, as it's always better to show rather than tell. And the oath is very present throughout the whole series, and it really does have an element of where you know how its presence is being affected, such as how you need to stick by your responsibilities in the winter story arc, and how also the element of losing faith when things get hard, which is very interesting. And the element of how one for all and all for one is better than one-on-one in the feud storyline, and you should not be so proud as to not accept help, and that help is one of the greatest things you can have in life, particularly from friends in the Bold storyline. So I'm glad that they were able to utilise it in a way that makes it more subtle and also makes it a perfect part of the story. In terms of the new themes that was introduced, one of the new ones that was introduced at the first part of the series was the element of realisation of where you are and harsh realities when coming to the end of a journey. This is the natural continuation from the element of having the previous series' dominant theme being on the element of a journey. With this series, naturally it had to be about the destination, but I like how they take the element of it's all about the journey rather than the destination and take you into a bit of a darker element, in that even in a situation where you've been striving to get somewhere for such a long time and have sacrificed so much as part of an effort of it, there's no guarantee that where you're actually going is what you're going to think it's going to be, and that you need to learn to live with that and also make the best of a bad situation. The place in which they go whilst being their safe haven away from danger is not a warm, welcoming place as they would think. Many of the previous residents reject the animals, and it goes so far to the point where it feels like they're almost being expelled and banished when it comes to the feud storyline, and Scarface demands for their removal. So it's an interesting cross between the idea of realising where you are and also having to fight for your own sense of belonging. It's an interesting way to take a dark but meaningful follow-up to the dormant theme of the last series. However, in terms of a dominant theme and the idea of making things darker than they were in the last series, the one where it may have dropped the ball was the further implication of the idea of mortality and danger. Farthing has always been an infamously dark and occasionally rather morbid series, though in many cases I feel it can get away with it in situations where it actually feels like it's called for, or it's just creating an environment. However, in this series, I feel that they took it a bit too far, and given the controversy from when this series was released and how much things were changed in the following series, I'm clearly not the only one. Now, admittedly, this show is meant to have an element where it feels like it is real life, and try and reflect what real life is like to a more dark and realistic pedigree, which is understandable, and I understand why they do that, and sometimes it does work. I mean, it definitely upped the body count this series, 17 new dead bodies, not including the actually nameless and faceless characters literally designed to be killed off. But there were a few times in this series where I felt it was trying to be like real life a bit too much, and it almost felt more like an animal snuff film. The primary examples being some of the parts in the first part of the series, such as with the deer being killed off and Scarface's murdering of some of the inhabitants of the park, where it became so gory and so almost exploitive in a way that it begins to become alienating. Now, I don't feel like there was anything in here that was too dark to show to kids, and given some of the films that have been released for children in the past that have gone on to become major successes that had elements that were just as dark or potentially even darker than this series, I don't feel too outraged by what they were showing, and it almost gives the sense of being a much larger scope and almost cinematic feel. But there is a line where you start to be like that, and you can potentially cross over it and just become straight up exploitive and overly gory for no real reason. And this one, while definitely balanced on that line quite finely, had opportunities where it nearly fell over to the dark side. This is also exacerbated by another thing that I've realised with the show, and has also come to me realising something about media in general, and also reminded me of a very famous term that's often utilised in comic books, but also other media: women in refrigerators. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term women in refrigerators refers to a very famous moment in the Green Lantern comics, and was popularised by famous comic book writer Gail Simone, in where she read a moment in the Green Lantern comic in where, when returning from home one day, Green Lantern found his girlfriend's body dead and stuffed inside his fridge. She then popularised the term women in refrigerators, which refers to whenever a female character, particularly in comics, gets horrible, horrible things happen to them, but not for the actual progression of their own story, but for the progression of the male character that they're technically the subordinate to. And in watching this series, I found that I've actually managed to figure out a term that I feel I could popularise that runs along the same veins as that one. Secondary character hunting. Secondary character hunting works in a very similar way to Women in Refrigerators, in where a character who is not the main player and mostly exists to either be a part to progress another character or just be there to provide some element that is not pivotal to the narrative, is either mercilessly or thoughtlessly killed off to either promote shock value or again just progress the story of the main character. Now, I will admit that secondary character hunting is not nearly as exploitive as Women in Refrigerators, because that was the element of taking a gender and demoting them, and also potentially making them subconsciously second-class citizens in the world of a certain fiction. But I still consider this a rather offensive way in that some writers consider secondary characters little more than just cannon fodder, and are there to just serve a simple purpose and eventually just be killed off, and the series definitely has an abundance of that. The prime example, of course, would be Mole's death, but also with Mrs. Vole's death, Mrs. Hare's death, and Mrs. Rabbit's death. Although thinking about it, you could refer to this to Women in Refrigerators given how many female characters have bitten the dust. It feels like these characters weren't killed off because they realised that there were no more stories to be told with these characters, and that, admittedly, with the ever-expanding cast, there was definitely a need to eliminate some characters to allow other characters to blossom. It feels more like a sense of, hey, we need to try and create some shock value and promote a character. Find a character who's not doing a whole lot and let's kill them. Now, granted, that's a bit facetious, and I might just be looking from this from the idea of a corporate sense of mind, but even so, to think that in some decision-making processes when creating this story, that they thought that they just needed to kill off these characters and the way that they decide to do them, just to make room for another one, and result in a lot of unfortunate and unnecessary deaths for certain characters, and some that bordered on being just insulting to the audience and how mercilessly they were done, or just how much they were ignored in the grand scheme of things. And while the Annals of Farthingwood doesn't really get ruined by this again, it is something unfortunate that relates to this series, and while having some presence in the previous series, it happened in a way where it felt like it was either foreshadowed effectively, or happened to characters that, one, you felt that they actually deserved it, or two, may have eventually died anyway because they were just the kind of characters that were going to get killed off. Here, it happens so randomly and without any kind of foreshadowing that it does definitely create a shock value, but not the good kind. It just creates the kind of shock of, why the hell would you even do this? Even with that said, and while this is admittedly something I don't like to see, and I definitely wish that the removal of some characters was handled a little bit more effectively, and in some cases may have not even had to have involved death whatsoever, it did still manage to add some sense of element of how this is a harsh and unforgiving world, and in some ways it does lead into the next prominent theme. The one other prominent theme utilised here stems from one which actually is a slightly more minor one that evolves into a slightly larger one. There's a very strong sense of either love or family relating into this series, which of course comes from many of the animals being able to find mates, and also how many of them were able to give birth to new young as well, which is also a very nice thing to see, and also makes it a lot more kid-friendly. But of course, being Farthingwood, it manages to take it into a darker turn, and here it makes it into an element of when you're defeated, but eventually realise the right choice all along. The reason why this relates to the family theme is that it primarily only relates to both Bold and Fox, though admittedly there are some other characters such as Owl and Badger that go through it as well, but it mostly relates to how Fox and Bold's characters progress through the series. Both of these characters have to make very strong and serious decisions, which not only affects them greatly, but also affects the people around them, and almost in both cases they don't work. However, when it doesn't work, they then realise what they learned from their mistake and realise what the right decision was all along, and it's an interesting way and also a very unique message to show to kids that even in how when you do something wrong, there's still something to be learnt, or in a more simpler way of putting it, we can all learn from our mistakes. And this show also does a very good job of showing it of how it can be done in two different contexts. When Fox realises after he's lost many things, he manages to do it at a time when he can still learn from his said mistake and be able to utilise what he's learnt effectively in the situation he's in. Bold, on the other hand, learns his lesson far too late and has to deal with the consequences of his decisions whilst not being able to do anything about it. And while this again might just be me overanalyzing things, in that the initial message was to probably just not refuse help and to listen to people who want to care for you, even if they don't seem like they mean well, the way I always saw it was on the idea of the similar message that The Lion King wanted to present. The past can hurt, but you can either learn to run from it or learn from it. And it's done a little bit more effectively because in this one, it's set up and delivered in a lot more effectively in the sense of the story, and two, we get two variations of the same one showing how it can happen two different ways that often do happen in real life. And it's the theme that leaves this show on its final note, creating, like I said, a bittersweet one, but not one that feels depressing or feeling like it was a non-warranted ending. It leaves you feeling like you've been through a great journey with two characters that had to learn a lot and realize what they needed to learn and eventually went through the task that they needed to go through. And with that ends my final thoughts on the second series of Farthing Wood. It has its rough edges to be sure, like any series of Farthing Wood has, but the stuff that works well in this makes this a highly enjoyable and arguably thought-provoking series. Many of the positives outweigh the negatives by a milestone, and the way they try and update things from the first series and also give it a bigger scale really works out, and makes this by far the most entertaining and best series in the Farthing Wood show. Hello again, it's me, and I'm here to give you my final word on the Farthing Wood series overview of Series 2. Quite the contrast from last year, because when then I did it on a Sunday morning, now I'm doing it on a Sunday evening, and I've been working so long, I'm just doing this really lazy boy style in my pyjamas and bare skin like dressing gown. But yeah, so I just want to thank a lot of people, and there's a lot of individuals I want to thank for this, so I'm going to get straight into it. The first person I want to thank is the first person who helped me out with this series, and that was the person who made the intro that I now use, who went by the name Culprit VFX. I'm going to keep his real name, I'm going to not mention his real name for various reasons, not the least of which being that I've not heard from him from a while. So if he ever manages to see this, then thanks a lot, buddy, wherever you are. Next people I want to thank is, of course, all of my university friends, well, basically all my friends in general, but particularly from university for being so supporting in my attempts to do this series. But most particularly, I want to thank Ben Cowdell for helping me out with just being such a big support and a very diligent fan of the videos, and Susanna Fantoni, who gave me the recommendation for the microphone that I now use. That was a fantastic suggestion. Thank you two very, very much. Obviously I want to thank my family, particularly my parents, for giving me so much support throughout all of this. And now on to the really long list. As you probably know already, I used a lot of fan art in this series, thanks to many users from DeviantArt, and I'm just going to list them off all here. Yes, I am. I know that I listed them all in a previous video, but these guys definitely deserve their thanks and credibility. So, big thanks to Ice Dragon Hawk, This Crispy Cat, Neko Phoenix, Usagi Sakura, Skia, Dibsib, Kaskra. Big thanks to all of you, but big thanks mostly to Snowstoat, who did some of the fantastic requested title cards that I asked for the overview series episodes. And big thanks to Rocky Gems, who also did some fantastic thumbnail art and also did the amazing banner design that I now have on my channel. So big thanks to all of you guys. You really helped out this series. And my final thanks goes to farthingwood.net, the forum, who were big followers and really helped make this series a big success. And I'm glad that they were so friendly and so sociable with basically a complete stranger coming into their established environment and saying, I've not spoken to any of you guys and I have this thing that you might enjoy, do you want to check it out? And they were so kind and very grateful. I'm very grateful for the way that they watched all of my things. But yes, so big thank you to every single one of the people who I've mentioned here, and also just every single one of you who has watched my videos. I couldn't have done it without you. Becoming a YouTube partner is a really big step for me, and I've been able to achieve a lot this year. It's been a huge year in terms of my YouTube career, and it couldn't have been done without you. You are the lifeblood and soul of my videos and my career, so I just want to thank every single one of you. So now that I'm basically done worshipping my fans, you probably want to know about the status of the Kickstarter. Well, I'm glad to say that the Kickstarter has reached its goal, and once again thank you to everybody who helped contribute to that. I have contacted the two biggest donators, and one of them has sent me back their request for a review that'll be out around about Christmas Eve this year. The other one has not yet gotten back to me, but as soon as they've given me what they want me to do, I'll obviously get to work on it. But yeah, so big thanks to everybody who helped support that Kickstarter, and I'll be sure to let you guys know once it's done, because this is definitely something that me and the team who are working on it, we want this to be a really great project. And now, yes, so what about the future of my career? Well, obviously I'll end up doing Farthing Wood Review Series 3 next year, but that won't be until next year, as you would imagine. But I am going to be doing a few more. Obviously, I'll be doing that request review around Christmas Eve. I'll see if I can do an overview, but I'll have to do, or not an overview, sorry, an in a nutshell video for this year, but it'll probably have to be a bit different because the last two I made were not able to be shown on YouTube due to copyright problems. So I'll probably have to do this really quickly, so it'll either have to be not that much footage of what I'm talking about or just a really quick montage of things that I enjoyed this year. I'm also working on 2 scripts for some upcoming reviews that will be coming out next year on some other well-beloved British children's TV shows from the late 2000s, not late 2000s, the late 20th century, from the 1980s and the 1990s. I cannot talk today. But yes, so I'll be working on those. I'm very excited because they're both shows that are very well loved, but also 2 shows that got a reboot recently this year. So I'll hopefully be able to get those out to you, so keep an eye out for those. And of course I'll be continuing with anything that I can to bring to you guys. I'm also thinking of doing potentially a very short and very quick cooking kind of show, because anyone who knows me personally knows that one of my biggest pastimes is cooking, and I've actually invented a few of my own recipes that are very good and sometimes healthy and really easy to make recipes. So I might make a few videos about how to cook them, largely because I think it'd just be fun but also very simple to make, but mainly because I've come up with a lot of really bad puns on what the names of these recipes are, and I know that some people I know personally would be ripping down my door just trying to kill me on the fact that I use them in the videos, and there's nothing I like more than stirring up a fuss. But yeah, so big thanks to everybody, of course. This year has been a fantastic success. Series 2 of Farthing Wood, I feel, has been a big groundbreaker for me personally. Obviously not everything has worked, and I do apologise for moments in where it sounds as if my voice doesn't quite sound so great, but if even this is proof that I can't talk forever without having a slip up every once in a while. But even with that, I'm mostly pleased and proud of what I've made, and the amount of support that you guys have shown for this year has really made it worthwhile. So big thanks to everybody, and I'll see you all next time.